Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about the Altcoin Reckoning. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We've been talking about the Altcoin Reckoning for essentially the last 2.5 years. And while it may seem like the Altcoin Reckoning ended long ago, as I have said for the last 2.5 years, the Altcoin Reckoning refers to the devaluation of altcoins against Bitcoin. That is what it refers to. And for the most part, for most, especially larger market cap altcoins, they just continue to put in new lows against Bitcoin. So if the Altcoin Reckoning is the devaluation of altcoins on their Bitcoin pairs, and if altcoins on their Bitcoin pairs just collectively put in a new low 2 weeks ago, then it means the Altcoin Reckoning has still been going on even when people didn't think it was, right? Even when people thought it ended, they still have been putting in lower lows collectively on their Bitcoin pairs. And so I know this is going to be a contentious subject, but I'm not going to stray away from my views just because people sort of like to mock them and whatnot. Again, you have to remember that the most vocal critics of my views on altcoins have told you Bitcoin dominance topped in January. They told you it topped in the summer of 2023, right? So again, yes, their altcoins went up on USD pairs because Bitcoin went up, but the altcoins are still being devalued collectively against Bitcoin. And in my own experience in the cryptoverse, altcoins are oscillators at best against Bitcoin. And what I mean by that is that at peak bull market mania phases, they reach approximately parity with Bitcoin, meaning the market cap of altcoins reach about the combined market cap of altcoins reach approximately the market cap of Bitcoin at major peaks, right? Where it's around 1. But at the end of the Altcoin Reckoning, the altcoins collectively reach around 1/4 of Bitcoin's market cap, 0.25. And so because I believe that altcoins are oscillators at best individually, then it means that collectively they are oscillators at best. So with that in mind, why should I assume that the Altcoin Reckoning would be over here when historically we see alt Bitcoin pairs drop all the way down to 0.25, right? Now again, we must remind ourselves what caused the Altcoin Reckoning to be over last cycle. In my opinion, again, it's just a thesis. It's not even necessarily true. It's just my view on the market. What caused altcoins to finally stop bleeding against Bitcoin? Well, there's two things. You had lower interest rates by the Fed, right? You had the Fed lowering rates. You can see that the Altcoin Reckoning last cycle ended in September of the pre-halving year after the Fed had already started to cut rates, right? The Fed has not started to cut rates yet. So that is one reason why I think it would be premature to assume that the Altcoin Reckoning is over. Furthermore, the other thing that ultimately led to the end of the Altcoin Reckoning, again, the devaluation of altcoins against Bitcoin, was the shift from quantitative easing to quantitative tightening. And you can see again that it was precisely that shift from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing that marked the end of the devaluation of altcoins against Bitcoin. Unfortunately, we still have not seen either of those events occur. We have not yet seen the Fed cut rates. and we have not seen the Fed begin to expand their balance sheet. And so what you're seeing is you're seeing the continued devaluation of altcoins against Bitcoin, while people will tell you that they are holding up well every step of the way down. Okay? Now, let's go take a look at some individual altcoins. Now, again, I know that anyone who watches this video, they're going to first a lot of people are going to go cherry pick a few micro caps that are doing well today and say, well, you're wrong. Guys, a few altcoins does not represent the collective altcoin market, right? If you have a majority of the top 10 altcoins by market cap putting in new lows against Bitcoin, that's what matters, right? That's the overall market. It's not the latest meme coin that's probably just going to go to zero next year. Just like a lot of the meme coins that people were talking about a year ago, no one cares about anymore. They're talking about new ones. So when you think about the devaluation of alt Bitcoin pairs, first look at ETH. ETH Bitcoin just put in a new low a couple of weeks ago, right? And so again, the biggest critics to my views on alt Bitcoin pairs were never telling you that ETH was going to go put in a new low in April. Furthermore, they were never telling you it was going to go put in a new low in January for this cycle, right? So again, there are a lot of critics to this view, but they also have only ever told you that the altcoin market had already bottomed against Bitcoin. And that's all they've said for the last year and a half. And they just keep seeing alt Bitcoin pairs go lower and lower and lower, while at the same time constantly saying that the altcoin market is quote unquote holding up well, or the ETH Bitcoin is quote unquote holding up well. But again, it has been a slow devaluation. Remember, the reason why they thought ETH Bitcoin had bottomed in the summer of 23 here was because that was when it essentially bottomed last cycle. But I think their mistake was assuming that it had to occur at the same time in the cycle, when in reality, the reason it occurred over here in 2019 was because the Fed had shifted to looser monetary policy, something that has still not yet occurred. So, ETH Bitcoin just put in a new low. Now, you might say, well, Ben, ETH Bitcoin is bouncing here. And you're right? It is. And I also said that if it's going to get one last bounce, it's going to be just after the halving. It also got a bounce in January, right after the spot ETF launch, right? So this is something we actually spoke about before it happened. I even mentioned many, many times that if it were to follow the pattern of last cycle, you might expect one little bounce at the end, ultimately to stay below the bull market support band that leads us into the final capitulation of alt Bitcoin pairs this summer. That has been my view, and it has been my view for a long time. You can see that ETH Bitcoin has been putting in new lows, okay? ADA Bitcoin has been putting in new lows. Dot Bitcoin, again, another altcoin that's pretty high by market cap that keeps on putting in new lows. Litecoin Bitcoin keeps putting in new lows. Matic Bitcoin keeps putting in new lows, right? A lot of these larger market cap alts are putting in new lows. AVAX Bitcoin is still off the low, but as I said before, it's following a pretty common pattern of alt Bitcoin pairs from prior cycles, where they set a low in the bull market, we then retest it, and then we just come back down to it and eventually break support. We saw the same thing with Dash Bitcoin in a prior cycle. Very similar move, right? Set a low in the bull market, retested over here. This is even retested basically in the halving year, late pre-halving year, early halving year, get a bounce, and then still fade back to where it was and ultimately go below it. And then you can see what it's done ever since, right? So even the ones that have not yet put in new lows, it doesn't mean that they're not going to. BNB Bitcoin has been a bit more resilient recently than other altcoins, but it also was putting in new lows as recently as December, right? As recently as December, it was putting in new lows. And again, I'm not trying to avoid this one. I'm saying like it has been showing more strength than some of the other altcoins. But guess what? A majority of the altcoins are still putting in new lows on their Bitcoin pairs. And to find ones that are not, you'd have to cherry pick ones in the top 20 that are not, or they're on their way to new lows right now, or you'd have to find a micro cap that was created recently and show that one that's not putting in new lows. But a lot of them are, right? And you can see that by looking at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. I think what you're witnessing right now is the last exit pump of alt Bitcoin pairs before we see final capitulation of alt Bitcoin pairs as we go into May and June. That is what I think. I've explained it many, many times, and I will stand by it despite what the critics say. And again, I could be wrong. I very well could be wrong. I'm willing to admit that now. I admit it. Like I very well could be wrong. I've been wrong about things. But this is a very similar pattern we saw last cycle where after setting a low here, we then had one final bounce that ultimately faded at that bull market, just below the bull market support band, and then it rolled over into the summer. And a lot of times you will see alt Bitcoin pairs capitulate in the summertime because a lot of people aren't as glued to their computers as they are during, during say the fall and the spring and the winter, right? During the summertime, people focus on other things a lot of times. And so the collective bid for the altcoin market can often sort of dry up. And so I think that that's what you're looking at right now. I think we're seeing alt Bitcoin pairs get this final bounce up, but I think they're going to ultimately fail here and go back down to the range lows. But this time when they break, I don't think there's going to be any mercy and another rally. I think it'll just lead you into the final capitulation, going back to 25% of Bitcoin's market cap. I do very strongly feel about this. And again, I know you might feel a certain way about that, and you might say, well, what about this? What about that? But at the end of the day, if alt Bitcoin pairs are putting in new lows as recently as 2 weeks ago, then the altcoin reckoning was still going on as recently as 2 weeks ago. It's just that people are distracted by the USD valuations of altcoins to even notice what their Bitcoin valuations are doing. We saw the same thing in 2019, just before the Fed cut rates. Alt USD pairs went up. They didn't go up as fast as Bitcoin. Bitcoin then eventually rolled over, and it crushed the altcoin market. And the altcoin market bled to the range lows. So my guess is that you will see alt Bitcoin pairs fall from this level about 42% against Bitcoin going into the summer. If you were to look at dominance of Bitcoin, excluding stables, you will notice that it tends to surge in the summer months. In fact, in 2021, you can see it surged in June, right? It surged up in June, and then it even went slightly higher in July. You can see it pretty clearly. That's when the dominance surged. And it also surged, by the way, on a Bitcoin USD dump. In 2022, we saw dominance, excluding stables, surge in June. And it also occurred on a Bitcoin USD dump. In 2023, we saw the Bitcoin dominance surge going into June. It did not tag the top of the wedge, but that one occurred on a Bitcoin rally. It started off on a Bitcoin dump, but it finalized on a Bitcoin rally. And so I say once again that because monetary policy has not yet shifted, why would my bias on this shift? If my reasoning for being bearish on alt Bitcoin pairs for the last 2.5 years has been based on monetary policy, and everyone can say I was wrong if they want, but Bitcoin dominance has been going up the entire time. I mean, that's the fact. That's the reality of it. As many trolls as there have been on my views on Bitcoin dominance, it's never stopped going up. I mean, it just continues to go up, and you get these pullbacks that make people think that that's it. But in reality, it was just another higher low, right? But the overall trend has been nothing but up for the dominance of Bitcoin, excluding stablecoins. And so I think that what you're going to witness here over the next couple of weeks is Bitcoin dominance will find a higher low once again, and it will then surge into the summer months, and the dominance excluding stables should hit about 64%, meaning the dominance including stables should hit around 60%. So 60% would get you right here, which coincidentally is exactly where the bubble on alt Bitcoin pairs began. This was when the major breakdown occurred. So I think we're ultimately going back up to that level. Again, as I previously explained, if you take the fib retracement tool, you will see that that corresponds roughly to the 618 retracement, which last cycle is precisely where the dominance of Bitcoin rallied back to by the end of the altcoin reckoning, the 618. That's where I think the dominance of Bitcoin is ultimately headed. Now, because the halving just occurred, there are a lot of vocal people that are saying that, okay, now they think the rotation into altcoins began. And look, it's because a lot of people believe that, which is what causes these bounces by alt Bitcoin pairs in the first place, right? Is because enough people believe it. Just like enough people believed it over here after the spot ETF, right? And the dominance surged for about 1 week, and then it just bled back down the following weeks. So I can't help but think that the people that are making that proclamation today that all Bitcoin pairs are done bleeding are making the same mistake that they did after the spot ETF. And so, yes, in the short term, you see more and more people flock into altcoins. They trade their Bitcoin for the altcoins. But my guess is that alt Bitcoin pairs are essentially going to roll over the next few weeks and go back down to the range lows. If you look at monthly candles of alt Bitcoin pairs, you will see a very similar pattern, right? Where last cycle you also had this same type of level being set. You then finally had this candle here, which had a wick lower than all the prior wicks, right? We just had that, right? We had the same thing. It had a wick lower than all the prior wicks. And then it was the following month that they finally capitulated. This was in May, and then the next month, June, is when alt Bitcoin pairs finally capitulated, and they were done trying to hold this level as support. And so I think that there is a high probability that you will see something very similar happen this summer as alt Bitcoin pairs get another drop. But this time, I don't think they're going to hold this as support. And I think they're going to bleed all the way back down to the range low. Again, alt Bitcoin pairs are oscillators at best. A lot of altcoins don't even oscillate against Bitcoin. They just bleed. Look at the Litecoin Bitcoin valuation. It's been bleeding since 2013, right? I mean, really right here since 2013, it's just been putting in lower highs and lower lows. A lot of the relics from prior cycles are doing very similar things, right? They get a major pump and then they just keep on putting in lower highs and lower lows. So if individual altcoins are oscillators at best, why would we assume that the altcoin market as a collective would be any better than an oscillator? So the glass half full approach is to say that it's an oscillator with deviations here and here, right? That's sort of the glass half. Let me switch this over to weekly candles. That's more so the glass half full approach, right? To say that it's an oscillator with slight deviations that occur occasionally to the upside and the downside. Glass half full. Glass half empty approach is to say, well, most altcoins bleed against Bitcoin over the macro scale. And therefore, what if the altcoin market is collectively bleeding against Bitcoin over the macro scale? As you can see, technically, this is a high, and this is a lower high, and a lower high, and this is a low, and then a lower low, right? So again, glass half full would say oscillator. Glass half empty person would say bleeder. But the point is that neither of those views would really support the idea that all Bitcoin pairs are done bleeding. Because even in the case where they are oscillators at best, it would still seem likely that they're going to bleed back to the range low. Now, you might think we're too late in the cycle for that to happen, but I disagree. Because, as I said previously, dominance didn't top last cycle until a looser monetary policy arrived. That means altcoins bled to Bitcoin, and they didn't stop bleeding until the Fed pivoted from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. So they lowered rates, and they pivoted from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. So my view is that we are going to witness a fairly large devaluation of alt Bitcoin pairs in May and June, and it could even go to July. If you were to look at ETH dominance, you can see that in 2022, it had a really big drop, right? Had a really big drop in 2022. And in 2023, it was sort of the opposite, right? ETH Bitcoin was actually at the top of this channel. But you can see that it's kind of sort of slowly bleeding into the summer. And it also is bleeding into the breakdown of the ETH Bitcoin valuation. And so I think you're going to see the ETH dominance fall a lot in May and June as the ETH Bitcoin valuation is falling. And therefore, that should put the Bitcoin dominance excluding stables at the top of the wedge. Remember, last cycle, what ultimately kicked off the grand finale of the Altcoin Reckoning was two things. It was the breakdown of the ETH Bitcoin valuation. You can see that when ETH Bitcoin broke down, alt Bitcoin pairs had their final plunge. This cycle, ETH Bitcoin has been breaking down, right? I mean, if you sort of draw this line across, you can see that ETH Bitcoin has in fact been breaking down. And ETH Bitcoin has been struggling, really. I mean, I know it's gotten a little bit of a bounce the last couple of weeks, but it is still stuck in traffic on struggle street as far as I'm concerned. As long as it's below the bull market support band, then who cares, right? So that was one thing. The other thing that really kickstarted the grand finale of the Altcoin Reckoning was the breakout of gold. So gold broke out right here, and that initiated the final stage of the Altcoin Reckoning. We're seeing something very similar here where gold broke out, and it's taking a little bit longer, right? But I think it's just kind of doing something similar to what it did right here. I think the Altcoin Reckoning is still occurring, and that people are going to say that ETH Bitcoin is holding up well the entire way down. And they've been saying it for the last 6 quarters. And my guess is by the time they finally get on board and recognize that it's not actually holding up well is finally when it bottoms. Now, if we want to cherry pick micro caps, we can go look at others Bitcoin. So this is everything outside of the top 10. Now, you might look at this and say, well, Ben, you know, it's already had a 60% drop and then a 60% rally. So, or a 70% rally. So how can you really say that the Altcoin Reckoning is still going on? As I've said many, many times, last cycle, it had a 67% drop, about the same, 68% drop here, 68% drop here. Then, guess what? It rallied About 70%. How is it any different? It's not. And guess what? It did not bottom until after the Fed started to cut rates. The Fed has not started to cut rates yet. But guess what? Others Bitcoin had a final 60% drop as those rate cuts finally arrived. Others Bitcoin has already dropped 20% from the highs. Who says they can't drop 60% from those highs? Which would be another 50% drop from the current valuation. Why not? It happened last cycle as rate cuts arrived. Why can't it happen this cycle? I think that there's a lot of people that are sort of thinking that the devaluation of altcoins against Bitcoin is over just simply because we are during, the halving is here and all that other stuff. But the reality is that just a couple of weeks ago, Others Bitcoin erased all of its gains since the summer of 2023. Think about that. All of the gains that Others Bitcoin had, the microcap valuation against Bitcoin, just a couple of weeks ago, they wiped away all the gains they had since the summer of 2023. Think about how much some of those altcoins rallied since the summer of 2023. And they just wiped away all those gains collectively in the span of about 1 week. It's always like that. It's always the stairs up and then the elevator down. And you can see the final devaluation of Others Bitcoin over here was a brutal drop, right? And I mean, who's to say it's not just happening once again? You first had this drop. You first had a 40-something% drop, and then a 30% rally, and then another 40% drop. So far, we've had a 30% drop. We've seen about a 20% rally. What happens if we just get another 30% drop? Why not, right? I mean, that would be sort of the best case scenario, I think, where it bottoms out at that low. That could happen. It could also go lower as well. But the point is that if it does come back down and retest this low, all Bitcoin pairs, including the top 10, are already at the lows. So that means that they would break down. So again, people can be frustrated all they want, but the reality is that alt Bitcoin pairs have never really stopped bleeding. And why should they? There has not yet been a shift in monetary policy. So I would recommend caution on the altcoin market, especially on their Bitcoin pairs. I know that a lot of people just say it doesn't matter and they only care about their USD pairs, but I'm telling you guys, they matter. They matter a lot. You know, looking at something like 1 over ETH Bitcoin, so just the Bitcoin ETH valuation, you can tell why it matters, right? You know, at the merge, 1 Bitcoin got you about 11.5 ETH when everyone was calling for the flippening. Today, 1 Bitcoin gets you almost double that. It gets you about over 20 ETH. This is why it matters. This is why Bitcoin dominance matters. I know a lot of people don't care about it, and they say, why do you talk about this stuff? But this is why it matters. You're throwing your money into all these altcoins. Look at 1 over ADA Bitcoin, the Bitcoin ADA valuation, right? People are throwing a lot of their money into altcoins as they just keep on bleeding back to Bitcoin. In September of 2021, 1 Bitcoin would get you 16,000 ADA. Today, it gets you 134,000 ADA. That's why it matters. Bitcoin is your unit of account. It is the standard, right? Why are you using US dollars as a standard? You know those go down. Bitcoin is the standard. And so if you're sitting there holding a large basket of meme coins and you're thinking they're going to durably outperform Bitcoin over the long haul, what are you thinking, right? I mean, there's only a couple that have ever done that over a longer period of time. What are the chances that the 100 that have been printed over the last month are going to do that? Please understand the devaluation of altcoins on their Bitcoin pairs is the altcoin reckoning, and they are still getting wrecked. For anyone who cares to look at their Bitcoin pairs, Matic Bitcoin, look at 1 over Matic Bitcoin. So this is the Bitcoin Matic valuation. The last time I did this video, look at what I was looking at. I was showing you how 1 Bitcoin got you 16,000 Matic in 2023, early 2023. The last time I did this video in February 2024, just a couple of months ago, I showed you that it was now equal to 51,000 Matic. Now, just 2 months later, 1 Bitcoin is equal to 90,000 Matic. This is why Bitcoin dominance matters. So many people are just so happy that the USD valuation of their altcoins are doing okay because Bitcoin's doing okay. But the reality is they're bleeding against Bitcoin. And what happens if Bitcoin drops, right? You have 2 scenarios. Bitcoin goes up or Bitcoin goes down. And if Bitcoin goes up, the altcoin market keeps bleeding back to Bitcoin, right? Because there hasn't been a shift in monetary policy. If Bitcoin goes down, the altcoin market keeps bleeding back to Bitcoin. Again, look at dominance excluding stables. When did we hit the wedge here? It was during Bitcoin USD drops, right? It was when Bitcoin USD was dropping. Here, and then here. When we didn't hit the wedge, it was when Bitcoin USD went up. What happens if it goes down? Then you have the more brutal part of the market cycle where all Bitcoin pairs go down while Bitcoin USD goes down. And I can assure you that's not a fun part of the market cycle. So again, there are a lot of people that have spent a lot of time mocking Bitcoin dominance and mocking the altcoin reckoning, the devaluation of alt Bitcoin pairs. But Bitcoin dominance has never stopped going up. Look at dominance, including stables. Look at dominance, including stables. Here it is. Now look at monthly Heikin-Ashi candles. Not a single red candle since November of 2022. That was the last red candle. You could have basically just stuck with Bitcoin over alts for the last year and a half, taken a lot less risk, and seen most of those alts become devalued against Bitcoin. Sure, you can go out there and use survivorship bias to tell me why I'm wrong about how these 5 microcaps have done okay. But you don't see Bitcoin dominance go up this much if most alt Bitcoin pairs are not bleeding, especially the larger market cap ones, okay? I don't care about, the 10,000th meme coin created, right? The reality is that a lot of people are buying those things up with the intention on getting rich, but in reality, the founder is likely just going to rug you when you're sleeping one night, and you're going to get upset about it, and then you're going to fall for it again probably if you're not careful. You have to be careful. I mean, I'm not saying that everyone falls for that stuff, but a lot of the people that are critical of these views fall for that stuff. They buy the meme coin, it rallies, they think they're a genius, they get rugged, they go do it again. And then before you know it, they have nothing. And all they had to do was just stick with Bitcoin, and they would have been so much better off. It's kind of like why holding the S&P 500 often is much better than trying to swing trade all these individual stocks. This is why, right? If you just hold the market, the S&P, you do quite well. If you just hold Bitcoin over a long period of time, you can do quite well. But we've seen the altcoin reckoning go on, the devaluation of alt Bitcoin pairs for a very long time. And I don't see a compelling reason why it's over. If you remember the social risk, we've talked about this a lot. It actually just put in a lower low, which just kind of looks like 2019, right? A low, and then ended up putting in a lower low. And then it got a little bit of a bounce here, right here in July. You see that little bounce by social risk after it put in a lower low? and then Bitcoin USD rallied back up there, back up to around the 8-week SMA. That's exactly where Bitcoin just rallied to, right? The 8-week moving average. If I pull it up on the weekly, you'll be able to see it. Right up to that 8-week. I said that 8-week SMA, that's going to be important. The reaction from that 8 weeks is going to be important. But you can see that the social risk just put in a lower low, just like it did over here, and then got a little bit of a bounce up as Bitcoin rallied back up to the 8-week SMA, just like it's getting right here as Bitcoin rallied back up to the 8-week SMA. But then the social risk came all the way back down to the 0 to 0.1 risk band in the summer of 2019. And then that is when finally alt Bitcoin pairs actually bottomed out. It was after this surge in social risk, followed by a move back to the downside. So I can't help but think that there's people are being kind of impatient with it and not letting this whole cycle play out because the timing of rate cuts is taking so long. But we said this a long time ago. We said higher for longer. We said the Fed was going to go to 5.5%, even when most people said they were going to stop at 3.5%. So why should it be different? I could be wrong. Look, it's possible we go into the summer and the reverse happens. And I know if that happens, I'll be in my corner for a while. But I do feel like I have to warn people about the devaluation of all Bitcoin pairs. I've watched my portfolio go down and down and down in its Satoshi valuation in prior cycles. And I recognized how easy it would have been just to stick with Bitcoin. The reality of crypto that really no one wants to accept is that the alt season that everyone wants usually only lasts a few months. And then after that few month rally by alts, they then spend the next 3 to 3.5 years bleeding. That's what happens. And I wish it were not the case. I wish that the market were different. I wish that you didn't see that happen. But what I want does not matter. What I want to see happen does not matter. What matters is what the market tells us happens. The alt season that you dream of only occurs in a few months of the entire market cycle. And then alt Bitcoin pairs bleed for the next 3 years. Look at that, 157 weeks. That's 3 years, right? Look at where we are. We're at 136 weeks. 157 weeks would put you in September of 2024. Why can't they keep on bleeding? They bled this long last cycle, right? So why can't they keep on bleeding? I think they probably could. So be aware that the altcoin market, if you want to think about the cycle as 4 years, right? A lot of people like to think about it as 4 years. It makes it simple. Altcoins bleed against Bitcoin for 3 of those years, and then you get 1 year where they outperform. But the other 3 years, they bleed, right? The 1 year where they outperform, in my view, has not started yet. And if it has started, it only just started because the altcoin market put in new lows against Bitcoin 2 weeks ago. So I still think we are about to witness the final devaluation of alt Bitcoin pairs going into the summer months. I think ETH Bitcoin is going to go to 0.03 to 0.04. Just like it has previously, you've seen those drops after breaking the range low. Here, it was a 50% drop. Here, it was like a 30% drop. Here, even if it's a 20% drop, it gets you to 0.03 to 0.04. So I think you'll see ETH Bitcoin at 0.03 to 0.04. I think you're going to see Bitcoin dominance at 60%. You should see Bitcoin dominance excluding stables at 64%. You should see ETH dominance taking out this low at 14%. You should see others Bitcoin at the very least back down to these lows at 0.16. I don't know if it's going to go below that, but I could see it going below that just like it went below it over there. And there you have it, right? Total 2 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin has also been just continuing to put in new lows, right? So again, I put out a lot of videos on the altcoin reckoning over the last 2.5 years. And the reality is that the biggest critics of it were bearish on Bitcoin dominance for the last year. But Bitcoin dominance continues to prove those people wrong over and over and over again. It keeps on going higher despite their best efforts to say that it's going to go down. It's because when you're in a high interest rate environment and quantitative tightening, late business cycle, high risk assets bleed to low risk assets. That's what happens. And we've seen it happen for the last 2.5 years already. I think it's going to go on for another few months and then it'll be over. And you might say, well, if it's a few months, what's the big deal? The big deal is that while we may be close to it in time, I don't think we're close to it in valuation, because I think all Bitcoin pairs still have about a 40% drop ahead of them. So that is the altcoin reckoning. It's been playing out for years. I think a lot of people are impatient, waiting for it to play out, but they've never stopped bleeding if you pulled up a chart and looked. So I think they're going to keep going down. We will see going into the summer if that happens. Look at alt Bitcoin pairs and see if they get rejected here at their bull market support band, right? If they get rejected here, just below it, just like they did over here, then that should be sort of the final nail in the coffin that begins their final journey to the lower part of the range at 0.25 of Bitcoin's market cap, 25% of Bitcoin's market cap. So those are my views. If you guys like the content, make sure you give the video a thumbs up. I do appreciate it. I don't ask for it for enough, but I would appreciate it if you guys give the video a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe. And again, check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We've got thousands of charts, not only for Bitcoin, but also for altcoins. You can call me a Bitcoin maxi if you want to, but I told you guys in early 2022, I was just going to put on my Bitcoin maxi hat until the Bitcoin dominance rally was over. And as far as I can tell, it just put in new highs a couple of weeks ago. There's no concrete evidence in my view that dominance has topped. Therefore, my Bitcoin maxi hat remains on. And I'm just trying to help people preserve the Satoshi valuation of their portfolio by not watching it disappear as their altcoin just keeps on bleeding back to the king. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.